Hello Jesper, welcome to Risks and Trends. You've been the CEO of Ingka Group for almost 3.5 years, and you've been with the IKEA Group for over 20 years. And looking back at your career in IKEA and Ingka Group, I was wondering if you've ever experienced anything like the COVID-19 pandemic in your managerial career.
No. I think it's easy to say that I have not met anybody who would answer anything different than no to that question. We are experiencing unprecedented times. The only reference points, even if that was, of course, more dramatic, is when people refer back to war times or conflicts like that. I've experienced a crisis before, and luckily, because you can learn a lot from leading in crisis. But the way the pandemic has changed everything for us and how it's influenced each and one of us and all of our customers at the same time is absolutely unprecedented.
And could you expand on that? Could you tell us maybe how the pandemic has changed the way you work, you've managed? Also, on the one hand, as basically a Swedish citizen, and on the other hand, as a business leader.
Well, I think to start with, I think the interesting thing with the pandemic is, of course, that it has impacted each one of us on an individual level. Isolation, quarantines, concerns about the future, the lack of meeting our relatives, our friends, and basically functioning in a normal way. In a way, you can say, in the middle of all that traumatizing and sorrows and losses, I think it's interesting because it brings us closer to each other. It's very, I think it goes for every country, every city, and every place where we are. And to that point, I think also the aspect of that life at home has been so important for people, wherever they are, has, of course, both become then a responsibility for us and a business opportunity. But what I think one of the things we have learned as a company is that we don't have a map here. The pandemic has continued to surprise us. It has continued to be very difficult to predict. And I would say at this moment, we have an attitude that it's going to continue to surprise us going forward. So for us to be agile, to be responsive, and at the same time have a strong moral and ethical compass and try to do the right thing for both the business, but definitely for people.
And you're a global business, so I think I understand that probably you saw the pandemic develop on the one hand in China, where you have a lot of business, on the other hand in Europe, obviously, but also in Russia, where the situation was different, and I think information was more scarce, and it wasn't quite obvious. When I was following the pandemic in Russia, it was pretty strange because you couldn't really find out what was going on. So did you see differences here when looking at your at the same business but in different places in the world? Because this was obviously a global sort of pandemic, a global instance, but on the other hand, it also happened locally.
I would agree to that. We were too slow the first weeks. I think we were in good company with most people in the world to believe that it would be contained in China. Of course, there was some historic data with SARS and other that was pointing in that direction, but that was wrong. After this, I would say we learned that lesson, and we since then, I think we've been quite good at both picking up dialogues with people, experts, but also, which has been important for us, stay close to ordinary people. And as such, we went into early March, we went into a mode to assuming that this will be equally spread, equally impactful in every country where we exist, and it proved to be the right thing to do. So thereby, after the first traumatizing days and weeks, when the pandemic spread outside China, I think we were quite quick to set up our routines, our risk management, our support for people, and the way we were capable to actually, in an agile way, run the business from online, offline, and whatnot.
Many people talk about new business models, new models of leadership that have evolved because of this managing by change and through different and difficult times. Have you noticed this? I mean, has this in a way impacted your business model? Has it speeded up processes, or are you pretty much on the same track but in a different reality?
I would say somebody said it's difficult to judge history when you're in the middle of it. And that's, I think, one of the sentiments we all have right now. So with a portion of humbleness, I would still say the main element as it looks for us right now is not a new business model, but speeding up everything. So if you look at the pure numbers of IKEA, we in March, we went from basically at that moment when Corona hit us, we were running approximately 10% of our business was online, if you like. So 90% was cash and carry. So with the closures, we had close to 80% of our stores closed for many weeks. And thereby you can say we would have, in an ordinary situation, we would have been in red numbers and in a really bad place from an economic perspective. But we were capable to switch to online. We were capable to use our stores as fulfillment centers, which was a strategy we had, but this speeded up that strategy with several years, I would say. And in a way, we managed to take back approximately 60-70% of our business. What we a little bit underestimated was, as we opened up IKEA again, there was a pent-up demand that was much bigger than we thought. So in the first and the second wave, when we've seen opening ups, we have had huge challenges to actually be able to acquire and get goods to our stores in time. So overall, I think the retail transformation, online, offline, omnichannel, interesting enough, the pandemic has helped us gain many years in development.
What are the biggest problems? Because you talk about your successes, but could you also address the challenges? What were the things that came difficult, that were a problem that maybe didn't work the way they should have? I'm thinking, I don't know, supply chains, subcontractors, maybe HR issues.
Absolutely. I would say to start with two areas predominantly. One was people. I was personally, I was sleepless a couple of nights on not knowing if we would be able to save jobs, be able to keep IKEA and Ingka afloat. And early on, we were also in some markets, we were engaging in the schemes that were set out. And I think a very good scheme set up for a furlough from governments in order to support the industry. Our predictions in the early days were very pessimistic, I would say. But as we started to act on it, we saw that we were capable, many ways thanks to omnichannel, to actually stay afloat. So one of the interesting questions for us became a moral question. Is it okay for us to accept government aid when we're actually still being afloat? So we decided to reverse all of that. Secondly, I would say, which is still going to plague all businesses, I think, for at least a year to come, and that is the imbalances in the supply chains. So we have massive challenges. I would say at this moment, it remains one of our biggest headaches, to say the congestions in ports, containers in the wrong places, boats being delayed, and the whole global distribution network is, of course, in a situation we could never experience or could never imagine in our lives. And in spite of that, I think we have managed to turn things around, be creative, and as such, we're actually catching up with some of the availability challenges that we've had. But it's difficult, it's challenging.
What are the lessons from this? I mean, looking at especially supply chains and this global situation, are you thinking about reorganizing production? Are you thinking about, I don't know, ideas like 4D printing? I mean, is this something that you've started talking about and planning for the future, or are you just waiting for the world to get back on track and to get back to what you were doing before the pandemic?
I would say all of those. Before Corona, we were, of course, working with what is the next level of supply chain production, etc. And for us, for example, if you mentioned 3D printing, we haven't yet seen any evidence that local 3D printing will be able to present the cost advantages and the environmental advantages that we see, for example, in the production we have in Poland, where we can build in affordability, sustainability, and smartness in a mass scale. So my bet at this moment would be that the production concepts that we use for the majority of our products will still be based on big volumes, I would say. Will it lead to more regionalization of production? Maybe. I wouldn't rule it out. But we should also remember that it's not only about distance for us, but it is the ever-changing landscape. So it's not only on the long trades that we've had problems. We have had problems within Europe, within North America, and so on. So I think the learnings have to come. It's definitely so. I think the best recipe for the world in the future is to fend itself for future pandemics and implement routines to make sure we avoid it. But also, I would say, with everything we know now, how we can protect ourselves with the right hygiene, the right masks, the right type of procedures. I think we can be better at running operations because this is most likely not the last pandemic we will see in the world.
Probably. My last question on the pandemic in this part. Everybody I've spoken to in Poland in retail keeps talking about flexibility, agility. I think you also mentioned flexibility, agility. And I understand that. I understand that you need to adapt to a changing reality. But looking at this from the perspective of long-term perspective of an organization, of the people who work in the organization, I guess that managing in permanent, rapid change must be very tiring and is difficult for an organization. I wonder how this has impacted your corporate culture. Is this something that you've discussed? And has this been a problem? Or on the other hand, do you just think that that's the way it has to be and we just all have to be on our toes, agile and ready to keep changing everything all the time? Is that healthy?
Well, if I start with, of course, it's challenging. And I think at the moment, I would say we're probably the same as everybody else. The longevity of this crisis, the marathon of it, and maybe also a lot of people were hoping for that the light in the tunnel would come sooner. So I think to hang in there and have stamina is something that I definitely recognize among my leaders. We have to work on providing much more opportunities for dialogue, to open up and be vulnerable and to share where you are and not hide emotions here, because it's difficult for many people. Some people it's difficult to run the ever-changing conditions of the operations. For others, it's the isolation that is a challenge, and for some it's both. But I would say, on the other hand, I think there is an opportunity here also from a leadership. We are not the same as before. We are much more flexible and agile today. In a way, we have learned things that we didn't know before. We have dropped a lot of the red tape. We are so much less bureaucratic. I think also in every market, more or less, the relations with governments, where we come together with governments, unions, and said, okay, let's drop some of the topics we had before and establish new links to actually resolve this for the common good. This I find absolutely refreshing. And one of the learnings we can maybe add here is IKEA since long has been with all the goods and bads, but we have been a very strong company culture with values gearing us. And what I found interesting during this crisis was that we acted very fast, almost everywhere at the same time. And I got questions from journalists early on how we could be so fast in directing and steering. But the truth was, to a certain extent, we didn't. People knew that they had a mandate to take decisions and do the right thing, and that was expected of them. So thereby, I think we were quite fast in actually mobilizing IKEA in the beginning. That I find interesting.
Okay, thank you. And now I'd like to move on to the other challenge of our times, climate change. I don't want to compare the two for a number of reasons, but I think there are certain areas in which there is an overlap. And I'm wondering if you think that today, looking at the challenges posed by the fight against climate change and possibly the effects of climate change, we're a bit wiser in 2021 than we were at the beginning of 2020? Or, I mean, are these two completely different parallel universes?
Well, it is what it is in a way. So to a certain extent, I think that there are reasons to be both more pessimistic and optimistic at this moment. But I would definitely say that the pandemic is helping us when it comes to the even bigger challenge, which is climate change. So with all the respect of the pandemic and the longevity of it, the aspects of climate change and the risks for humanity here is basically existential and at a level that even the pandemic cannot match. So I would say at this moment, I would say if you want to look at it with a bit pessimistic view, what we know now compared to 1 year or 3 years or 5 years or 10 years ago, the challenges look even bigger. the risks of us actually not only missing the 1.5 target, but even hitting much higher temperatures in our lifetime is unfortunately one of the scenarios. So, and to that, you have economic rebuild, you have, of course, the political topics, you have the development in developing countries. There are many factors here that would point in the wrong direction. But on the other hand, on the optimistic side, I see a lot of signs to be optimistic. To start with, the debate has moved the last year, I would say, from the last years from debating if this is a problem. There are a couple of few people, leaders out there who deny climate change or don't want to realize the facts. But I don't think that's where the debate is going to be at all. So the debate is moving from, is this a fact? Why is it important to actually, what do we do about it and how can we act on it? And this is refreshing. I'm part of the World Economic Forum Climate Alliance, and I'm part of new collaborations where competitors, where value chain partners, and where governments and companies are meeting up to actually discuss solutions. We are still, I would say, far from being able to have a plan for the world with all the actions that needs to be in place. But the discussions are about that and about the right topics. And that brings me a lot of optimism.
And what does this mean for IKEA as a business? How has the actual things that you are doing, have they changed over the last, say, 12 months? And where are you heading with this? And do you have sort of far-fetching plans in terms of countering?
I would say the last 12 months, we have actually speeding up all our knowledge, but also our initiatives and investments. So we have put some of the investments earlier. We have added to the basket of actions. Now, I would say, what this means for IKEA is, I would say sustainability is what's going to make IKEA successful in the future. And this is a very important aspect that I'm very happy to share with all companies out there, because sustainability is not a pain or an issue. It's actually the new way that we invest in and create the new low cost of tomorrow. It is about energy smart. It's about resource smart. And of course, if you know IKEA, we're all about trying to bring down costs and be affordable for the many people. So rightly executed, sustainability is the way we build economy 2.0, basically. There are hurdles and barriers. There are investment barriers. There are decisions that needs to be taken together with the governments around the world, including Poland, on how do we incentivize the new economy? How do we make sure the early investors in the new economy are enticed to actually take the decisions earlier rather than later? But when it comes to the three big infrastructure shifts, energy, I'm very optimistic. Everything points out that the renewable energy equations, unsubsidized, is the right, and we have the solutions, and they are happening as we speak. Mobility, the same. It's not as far, but it's coming. One of the most successful companies in the world is making only electrical vehicles, and we have so many examples of that out there. When it comes to the part we represent, consumption, we are, I think, only in the beginning, but we have started to see signs of actually constructing a business model for sustainable consumption, where we build our offer on recyclability, renewable materials, electrical and renewable energy throughout the value chains. So IKEA's plan is very sincere. It's leading us up to 2030, where we are aiming to be climate positive by many different actions on the things that really has an impact.
Okay, thank you for that. I wanted to ask you about the trends, and probably this writes itself into what you were just saying, but about the trends of that will shape our tomorrow. Many people talk about deconsumption. I guess you also tend to talk about deconsumption. I have to say that, however, deconsumption sounds like a great idea, it doesn't ring very honest in the words, in the mouths of business leaders, because at the end of the day, you have shareholders, you have profits. How do you match that from, on the one hand, from the perspective of IKEA and your shareholders, and on the other hand, from the perspective of the rebuilding of the global economy? How can we progress consuming less?
Thank you. And thank you for bringing this topic up. I think it's one of the most important topics for us to discuss now. Personally, I don't use the word deconsumption. I think there is, as always, if we jump to the solution before we have analyzed the problem and agreed on the problem, I think we might choose the wrong one. I hear voices saying that we should stop consuming. I don't see that happening. I hear a lot of voices talking about the premium for sustainability and what we need to be able to cost. I think that's at least politically naive and could lead us into a disaster. If you look at the political movements around the world, where do you see where we ignore the big groups of people? Where is that going to work? There is no such evidence. And to be honest, I don't see the need for it also. I can talk about the challenges and the unsolved parts of the puzzle, but I think it's important to also start in the other end. IKEA in Poland and IKEA Global has invested in renewable energy. Today, it's a great business for us. It was a decision for us to match other investments, but today it was a good investment decision. So we have now more wind and solar than we need for our own operations. That's one example. It's not small. It's a trendsetter for the future. We are 2025. We're going to be 100% electrical vehicle in all our home deliveries. There are some real challenges because different cities and countries are on different places with this. But already in Shanghai, we are 100% implemented. Amsterdam, New York, Los Angeles, many more cities are on the way. Copenhagen, Oslo, etc. This is not, I would say, a sacrifice or a premium, but the new way of doing it. If you take the city of Paris, recently announced that it will be difficult to get into the city if you don't use electrical. So, and if I continue down that road, it's not about deconsumption. It is about respecting that also in the future, the many people, even more people, would like to have a beautiful home and a functional home. And they will have thin wallets. So the question is, how do we provide that? Overconsumption and stupid consumption should be rooted out, of course. But how do we provide solutions for prolonging product life length, for making it easier for people to work with secondhand, to buy back, and then all the way to bringing back materials that we are investing now, taking back mattresses, other types of materials, and making new products. And I'm absolutely convinced that we are about to crack a consumption model which is then climate neutral or positive. And this is what we need to talk about. The other two, I think the arrogant capitalistic old school will not work, and the de-consumption will probably not work also. So we go for the middle road.
Okay, that makes sense. I wanted to ask you, before we move on to the final part, to Poland, I wanted to ask you about the other trends that have come up during the pandemic, that have speeded up during the pandemic, and that might impact your business, which I find personally interesting. One of them is deurbanization. I don't know if you're seeing that. I know we're seeing that in Poland, where many people have started moving out of cities, or at least living part of their lives outside of cities, and probably they won't come back. So some people are saying that the 21st century is going to be the century of the countryside, as the 20th century was the century of the city. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but if you would, how would that impact you? And the other thing that's probably sort of closer to our hearts today is de-officization, if I may coin a phrase that doesn't, I think, exist. Basically, the fact that we're going to be working more from home, which is also probably inevitable. So these two, and maybe others, if you have any up your sleeve.
I haven't heard that word before, but I think it's the right word, actually. So, well, it's interesting. I would say this is how I think we should do it together. I think we should recognize the trends, but then stay very humble for how they will play as variables. You have the pandemic, of course, in the short and midterm, and possibly in the long run, that we need to take out for. We've spoken about climate crisis, which is a variable in all the demands, supply chains, legislation, financials, and all sorts of human calamities that could happen. If I would say in our business, you can say the whole shift and the focus on life at home, which is interesting enough. It has never happened on a global scale before. Now, the pandemic has put a totally different attention to life at home. That's an important trend for us. You raise the uncertainties and maybe the futurism of the supply chains. So that's definitely one of the variables. And then you can say, it's difficult, I think, at this moment to say which trend is a real trend when it comes to urbanization and such. I'm convinced that we will learn how to work in smarter ways. When it comes to the conclusion at this moment, it's clear that people will also post the pandemic be smart about why we travel and why we use physical meetings. But I also see that, as somebody said, a virtual hug is nice, but it doesn't replace a real hug. And I think the understanding of what physical will mean will also prevail. When it comes to urbanization or not, from a climate perspective, urbanization is a good idea. It's easier for us to resolve some of the big challenges in big cities. So that would speak for that. And all other trends before the pandemic would probably speak for that the de-urbanization might be temporary. But who knows? My point would be to say, identify the variables and then be very good at scenario planning. Don't believe in just one scenario, but play with the variables and understand how your company, your business, your organization will be impacted if different things happen. This is, I think, the agility model that we are all learning right now.
Okay, so moving on to Poland and using the scenarios you talk about, I understand that yesterday was, or a couple of days ago, was your 60th birthday in Poland, so happy birthday. I wanted to ask you what Poland means for IKEA today and what scenarios are you planning for the Polish presence in the group? Do you think that Poland is still going to be as important an element of your global business, or do you think that, as I asked at the beginning, it's going to be rather spread out and you're going to be sort of defragmenting production and also operations throughout the other countries that you operate in and maybe spreading wider, and how this would impact Poland?
I think to start with, looking back, IKEA Poland is a love story, and I think IKEA wouldn't exist without Poland. I don't know if people might not know the story, but way back when our founder started the company, I think the first real challenge he met was being actually boycotted by producers in Sweden. This is way back. And through some different coincidences, there was a contact established with people in Poland. And Ingvar Kamprad and his first entrepreneurs and the leaders in Poland established a link and actually, in a very entrepreneurial way, set up a collaboration that made actually IKEA survive, I think, in the first real crisis. So ever since, I think, those days, there's been a gratitude and an inspiration from our founder and IKEA to be very close to Poland. Today, Poland is, and it's going to be tomorrow as well, I'm sure, Poland is one of the few places in IKEA where we have everything. We have production, we have distribution, we have stores. We experiment with everything in the new omni-channel models. We have windmills. We are approximately 15,000 co-workers, so it's a big group of people. Indirectly, we need to add at least another 75,000 people, I think. So we are up towards 100,000 people that are engaged every day, earning their money on the IKEA model. But moreover, I would say there is something that resonates, I think, with IKEA culture and Polish culture. I've been so many times in Poland. I've always found it's a culture where you, when there are challenges, you don't bow. You stand strong in the wind and you accept challenges. And I would say from an entrepreneurial point of view, I've seen incredible creativity and speed in solutions in Poland. That has been so important for IKEA. So I think when we look at the future, who knows these days? But we are celebrating the first 60 years, and we are very hopeful for another 60 years at least with IKEA in Poland.
Well, happy birthday again, and thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you for your time, Jesper. Very interesting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.